So today is not going to be anything different, just that within the large intestines, digestion and absorption is quite different as compared to the rest of the GIT. So on the anatomy of the large intestines, as we can all see on this diagram, this is the large intestines. And usually the large intestines is a continuation from the small intestines. And as we saw last week, we said that the small intestines were divided into three parts. We looked at the duodenum, we looked at the jejunum, and then we looked at the ileum. So the large intestines is a continuation from the ileum, which is the large part of the last part of the small intestines. So as we mentioned last week, we said that there is a valve that guides the movement of content from the small intestines into the large intestines. And that one is termed the ileocecal sphincter or ileocecal valve. It's the same thing. So there's a valve here that guides movement from here, from the small intestines into the large intestines. And this valve also makes sure that the content that is inside the large intestines do not go back into the smaller intestines. Later, we'll get to know the reason why it is not good for content that is already in the large intestines to go back into the smaller intestines. Because later we'll learn that the small intestines contain only feces. And we don't want a situation whereby feces will go back into the smaller intestines. If it goes in there, it will lead to a pathogenic conditions. And that's what we don't want to see. Look, if we take a critical look at the large intestines, it has, as I said, it starts from the last part of the small intestines, which is the ileum, and then it moves all the way to a last end called the anus. So that's what we are going to look at. And this one contains 4 major regions. And these regions include, 1, we have what we call the cecum. And after the cecum, we have another structure called the colon. And this colon is also divided into parts that we'll be looking at. We have what we call the ascending colon. Then we also have what we call the transverse colon. Ascending colon means is ascending, is going up. So from the cecum, then we have ascending colon that ascend up to almost where the liver is located. So when it gets to just inferior to the liver, then it makes a sharp turn. It makes a sharp turn in the transverse position. So once it courses in the transverse position, and that's what we call the transverse colon. So from here to here, and where it makes a sharp turn, it forms a fissure or a groove, a smaller groove called the right colic flexure. Here, this is what I'm referring to. So from here, it takes a transverse turn, then it makes another turn. It takes another sharp turn, and then it descends down into the iliac region. So from here, it forms another flexure called the left colic flexure, and that one is immediately inferior to the spleen. So sometimes it is called the splenic flexure. So from here, we have the descending colon that goes all down closer to the iliac region, and that is the left iliac region. So when it gets to the iliac region, then it takes another turn, forming what we call the sigmoid colon, because of the way the the colon shapes, it is called the sigmoid colon. So from there, then it continues with another structure, which is the third region of the large intestine. It's called the rectum. So we have the rectum here, which is also made up of smooth muscles. So from here, then we have the anal canal that ends at the anus. Later on, we'll get to learn the different types of muscles that we find in here, especially on this diagram. If you look at this diagram, the top part is what we call the rectum. This area is the rectum, which serves as a storage area for feces. And then from there, we have what we call the anal canal. Canal means just a channel where the content will pass through to the exterior or to the outside. So when you get to the anal region, as I said earlier, the anal region is made up of two types of muscles. We have the inner muscle and we have the outer muscle. The inner muscle is made up of smooth muscles. And usually smooth muscles are involuntary. They are not under conscious control. So we have what we call the internal anal sphincter. Then we also have what we call the external anal sphincter, which is also made up of skeletal muscles. And skeletal muscles are usually under conscious control, so it is voluntary. Later on, we'll get to learn the essence for the two sphincters that are found here. One is inside, one is outside. They all have a specific role they play. So we'll be looking at that. So the whole length of the large intestines is about 5 feet long, and it has a diameter of 2.5 inches. So as I said, it's made up of the ascending and descending colon, cecum, and then we also have what we call the appendix. Sometimes it is called the vermiform appendix because it looks like a worm. Because of its appearance as a worm, it is called vermiform appendix. And this appendix is attached to the rest of the large intestines by a mesentery called the mesoappendix. This is just the mesoappendix that attaches the appendix to the rest of the and then we'll look at the histology of the large intestines. What is it made up of? That's what we are going to look at. Typically, if you look at the GIT, all the organs are made up of 4 types of layers. As I mentioned earlier, we have the mucosal layer. The innermost part is what we call the mucosal layer. Then we have the submucosal layer, which directly follows or lies beneath the mucosal layer. So from there, we have the muscles called the muscularis layer is also following that of the submucosa. And then we have the outer covering of serous membrane called the serosa or the serosa here. So the large intestines are also made up of the same types of layers, 4 types of layers that we find. Now, but there are some unique characteristics of the large intestines that we have to look at. The last time when we were looking at the smaller intestines, we said that there were certain cells that we find in the smaller intestines. In the smaller intestines, you can find the absorptive cells. Here again, are usually responsible for the absorption of water within the large intestines. Just that if you look at the surface of the large intestines, it is not like the smaller intestines, because the smaller intestines they are made up of microvilli, or they are made up of villi that gives a larger surface area for absorption to take place. But in the large intestines, those villi cannot be found here. So because they are not there, it looks more smoother. The only thing you can see are the openings of the intestinal glands that you find, which are here. So that is why water absorption is not much done within the large intestines, but it is largely absorbed within the smaller intestines that we saw last week. Then the mucosa of the large intestines also has another type of cells called the goblet cells. As I spoke to you last week, I said the goblet cells are responsible for secretion of what we call mucus. And this mucus, what they do is that they lubricate the content that goes into the large intestines so that digestion can be made easier. These two types of cells that I spoke about, both of them are located within the intestinal glands. And as I mentioned last week, I said these glands are also called the Krebs or Lieberkühn that we find in there. So this is just an example of the glands where they are found. So this one is the intestinal gland, and these intestinal glands are lined with the various types of cells. We have what we call the absorptive cell. The absorptive cell has a brush border. I don't know whether you can see the other end. It is made up of a brush border because of the way the lumen side looks. It looks like a brush. So it is termed as brush border. So it is made up of a brush border over there. And then we also have the goblet cells. This is a typical type of a goblet cell that have been magnified. So here they also secrete what we call the mucus. So histologically, that is what the walls of the large intestines are made up of. Before we move on, I just want us to look at a particular condition. This condition is a surgical emergency. Why do I say a surgical emergency? Because if you have this condition, within the next 1 hour, 30 minutes time, you are supposed to have an intervention. If you don't have an intervention, it can be life-threatening. And that is where we don't want to go to. And that is what we call appendicitis. Any word you see itis, that means there's inflammation. And this particular one, there's inflammation of the appendix. The appendix that is attached to the cecum, the cecal area. This is what I'm referring to. So if this particular organ or this particular structure that we are seeing, if it becomes inflamed, then it becomes a surgical emergency. But there are certain things that can lead to can cause the inflammation of this structure. Some of them include if it has a lumen that passes this way. So if the lumen end is blocked by feces, because here we indicated that the large intestines is made up of feces. So if some of the feces go into the appendix and it gets blocked, with time there will be a reaction within the appendix. Microorganisms that are going into we have other foreign bodies. Sometimes people even say that if we like eating guava, the seeds can accumulate inside the appendix, and that will lead to inflammation that we don't want to go into. Now, how will you know you have appendicitis? Usually, appendicitis is being manifested by increase in body temperature. If you have appendicitis, your temperature begins to rise very high. And so if you have that, usually they request that you do your full blood count. And then when you do the full blood count, the white blood cells count will be very high, especially the neutrophils will be very high. Then people with appendicitis usually feel a pain within a particular region we call the iliac fossa. So within the iliac fossa, you are more likely to experience severe pain there. And the pain is responsive when you touch that area. So the person is going to feel the pain around the iliac fossa. Then the person will lose appetite if you have appendicitis. And then you might have nausea and vomiting resulting from the appendicitis. As I said, there's pain that localizes in the right lower quadrant. If you divide the abdomen into 4 quadrants, the right lower quadrant, that's where you are most likely to feel the pain. And that's what we call the iliac fossa. And then if this condition is not treated, the infection may progress and then it might lead to perforation. It might perforate your peritoneum. It might perforate the appendix, and the infection will spread to what we call the peritoneum, which will lead to what we call peritonitis that we don't want to get to. So within 24 to 36 hours, it's very dangerous. If nothing happens, it might lead to what we call peritonitis that we don't want to get into. Now we'll go into digestion. Within the large intestines, just as we saw in the